You're listening to The Unsafe Bible with Pastor Ken Brown.
That's what the nations wanted. They didn't want God. They wanted to be able to chase after these false angels, these fallen angels, these false gods. So God said, great, I'll give you what you want. He tends to do that when people want to go off into sin. You want that? Great, not a problem. Then he checks back with you 10 years later or so. How's that working for you? He does that all the time. When I make decisions that are outside of his will, he has this tendency to come back, Ken, how's that working for you? All right, Lord, you're right. I need to do it your way. Say that louder, Ken. That's just the way he does it.
Life can be a complex journey, full of choices, challenges, and moments of triumph and trial. Today, Pastor Ken reminds us through today's message that you mess up and fall into sin. We're all human, prone to make mistakes, and occasionally we may lose our way. At times, we might find ourselves entangled in the consequences of our choices. Sometimes God will allow this to show you why you need Him. He allows us to experience the pain of our own actions, not to condemn us, but to lead us back to Him. Well, let's join Pastor Ken in the book of Ezekiel, chapter 28, as he continues his message, It's All About Me.
God had a plan for the nations. We saw it. They were to be fruitful, multiply, and fill the earth. They rebelled. They didn't want to do that. They wanted to do their own thing. They wanted to build a tower. They wanted to communicate with God at their level. They weren't really trying to get to God. They were trying to get to the fallen angels so they could get more wisdom, they thought. Does that change from today? I mean, we have people who become involved in weird, strange religions so they can communicate with God. It hasn't changed, has it? It really hasn't. And God divorced the nations, literally. He said, okay, fine, that's what you want. You don't want me? Fine, I'll make sure you don't have me. So he appointed 70 fallen angels, or 70, they may not have been fallen at that point, but they were 70 divine beings, 70 angels. Angels, in my mind, is a job description. 70 rulers, principalities, powers, whatever you want to call them, over each of these nations. We know the name of one of them. His name, we see in the book of Daniel, his name is Michael. He's overseeing Israel. I don't know who's overseeing the United States. I don't know what nations that angel has overseen in the past. Sometimes I wonder if his name's Ichabod, which means the spirit has departed, but I don't know. I don't know who he is. Deuteronomy 32, 8 and 9, we get some more information in regards to what was going on here in Babel. When the Most High gave the nations their inheritance, when he separated the sons of man. In other words, when he took them and said, since you're trying to do this and you're sinning, I'm going to separate you all out and give you different languages. And literally, they all went to different places. And it's really interesting how they did it. All the languages that are to the east of Jerusalem read from right to left, and all the languages to the west of Jerusalem read from left to right. And I don't know how, they all point to Jerusalem. I don't know how that happened, but that's where they wound up settling. When the Most High gave the nations their inheritance, when he separated the sons of man, he set the boundaries of the people. So he's basically saying this is China, and this is Malaysia, and this is Asia, or North Asia, or Russia. And he kind of set out these boundaries according to the number of the sons of Israel. And you're going like, that's interesting. He set the boundaries of the people according to the numbers of the sons of Israel. For the Lord's portion is his people. Jacob is the allotment of his inheritance. So we see it right there, Israel is his. The Septuagint version of this section of Scripture gives us a little different picture. And you have to remember that the Septuagint version is a translation of the Hebrew text that existed in 250 BC. The translation that we have today in the text is what's called the Masoretic text, which was appointed by a group of folks called the Masoretes around 150, 200 AD. So there's a difference in the text, and since then we've found copies of things called the Dead Sea Scrolls that point us back to certain things. But in the Septuagint version, Deuteronomy 32, 8 and 9 reads, when the Most High distributed nations as he scattered the descendants of Adam, okay, great, we saw that, he set up boundaries for the nations according to the number of the angels of God. So what we saw before is it said, separated them out according to the numbers of the sons of Israel. Here, the rabbis who translated thought the Hebrew didn't say that. They said the Hebrew is pointing to the number of the angels of God. So he's pointing again to these 70 angels who are overseeing this, his divine council. And his people, Jacob, became the portion of the Lord, Israel, and the allotment of his inheritance. Okay, great. By the way, the difference in some of it doesn't deal with doctrine at all. It's just, there are some words that appear one time in the Old Testament, and you sit there and go, what does that mean? And sometimes you don't know. So we get clarity from these other sources. That's all that does. There's other words in the Greek that are like that too, but more so in the Hebrew. The manuscripts, again, talking about that, it's used in most English Bibles, is derived from the Masoretic text. It was determined by the Masoretes during the medieval period. And they're the folks who actually saved the text for us and made sure we had an Old Testament. Any text of the Hebrew Bible produced by the Masoretes is around 600 to 950 AD. Whereas the Septuagint, when we look at that, we're looking at what the rabbis said the translation was based on the text that they had in 200 BC. So there might have been some changes since then. That plus there were a group of Jews who did not like the fact that the Christians were using the Old Testament as part of their Bible and they were trying to do things. The Masoretes prevented that from happening. But they had a different view of what some of the words meant versus the rabbis in 200 BC. That's all it is. The Greek version of the Old Testament, which is known as the Septuagint, is very unique. Its chief value is that it is a version of the text that's 1,000 years older than what we see in the Masoretic text. And then when they found the Dead Sea Scrolls, they found material that was about the same age. And it reads just like reading the Septuagint. In particular, prior to the formal revision of the Hebrew, which took place in the 2nd century AD, it supplies materials that show an older form of Hebrew than what we see in our Bible. So again, it's more definitional stuff. It's nothing that deals with doctrine. But that's also why when you read some of the things that Christ says, and then you look at your Old Testament, and you're going like, well, that's not what it reads here. Well, it's because Christ is quoting from the Septuagint. He's not quoting from the Masoretic text. They may have had a different word than what he used. Septuagint, by the way, is represented by the Roman numbers LXX. It just means 70. But there were actually 72 translators. So anyway, there you go. But the reason why we look at the Septuagint is it gives us insight as to the scriptures that Jesus used, because he was the one using the Septuagint. That's the version he and his disciples would have been familiar with and would have used. And they may have been using the Greek text. There are some folks who think that some of the books that we have in the New Testament, which are in Greek, were originally written in Hebrew, then translated back to Greek. The book of Hebrews is one that they think was done that way. I don't know if there's any truth to that, but that's just people who have nothing else better to do when they're studying their Bible, and they start thinking of strange things. But back to what we have here at hand. What happened in Genesis 11 is that as a reaction to the sin of Nimrod and the nations wanting to create a method outside of God's plan to take advantage of contacting fallen angels, God provided for all these different language groups and people groups so that they wouldn't be able to do that. They couldn't get together. I mean, it's kind of tough to get together and talk if you speak Spanish and your next door neighbor now speaks Malaysian. Hard to do that. Yahweh, in effect, decided that the people of the world's nations were no longer going to be in a relationship with him. He was going to choose the nation of Israel. But using Israel, he was going to reestablish the means for the entire world to come back to him through Jesus Christ. But he was going to initially start with a covenant relationship with a people that didn't exist yet, called Israel, and he was going to do it through a guy by the name of Abram. So God placed the nations of the world at this time under the guidance of a group of spiritual beings that we do see show up in the Bible from time to time. We see them occasionally. And that's harsh. It's a harsh decision, but that's what the nations wanted. They didn't want God. They wanted to be able to chase after these false angels, these fallen angels, these false gods. So God said, great, I'll give you what you want. He tends to do that when people want to go off into sin. You want that? Great, not a problem. Then he checks back with you 10 years later or so and says, how's that working for you? He does that all the time. When I make decisions that are outside of his will, he has this tendency to come back, Ken, how's that working for you? All right, Lord, you're right. I need to do it your way. Say that louder, Ken. That's just the way he does it. But God disinherited the nations. And in the very next chapter of Genesis, he calls Abram out of the same area, Mesopotamia. That's where everybody was. He calls Abram right out of there. It's not accidental. God takes a man from the heart of the rebellion and makes a new nation called Israel out of that man. But in his covenant, God said all the nations of the earth would be blessed through Abram, not through the other nations. And if you recall, as we studied the nation of Israel, at one point, they were all going to be priests, right? But then they had this problem with the golden calf. And then he comes back to, it's going to be the Levites, that's it. But it was supposed to initially be everybody. Again, sin got in the way. The point of verses 8 and 9 of Deuteronomy 32 is that sometime after God separated the people of the earth at Babel and established where on the earth they were going to be located, he then assigned these 70 nations, these 70 families, to fallen sons of God, who were 70 in number, giving them what they wanted. They wanted to commune with fallen angels. Great, I'll have one rule over you. Or he knew they were going to be fallen eventually. After observing humanity's rebellion before the flood, and then again in the Babel incident, God decided to desist in his efforts to work directly with humanity. And of course, God knows everything. He knew he was going to have to do that anyhow, which just blows my mind. But in an act reminiscent of Romans 1, and when you look at this, you start thinking about, well, God gave up in Romans 1. We see something like that happening. God gave humanity up because of their persistent resistance to obey him, and his new approach was to create a unique nation, Israel, for himself. And he records that immediately in Genesis chapter 12, very next chapter. So each pagan nation was overseen by a individual much more inferior. They're created. God created them. So they're not being seen by God. They're being overseen by someone who's been assigned to it. By the way, guess who's replacing that council? It's in Revelation. We are. We're the ones who are going to be replacing all those fallen angels to rule over the planet Earth with Jesus. So it's kind of interesting. I want to learn a little bit about these guys because we're going to be replacing them at some point. It's kind of interesting to get that. Romans chapter 1, this is where we see God giving up people who aren't serving him. And this is what happened in Babel. The wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men who suppress the truth in unrighteousness, because that which is known about God is evident within them. God made it evident to them. For since the creation of the world, his invisible attributes, his eternal power, and divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood through what has been made, so that they are without excuse. That right there is why occasionally a missionary will go to a people's group that has never heard the word before. They finally learn the language and talk to him about Jesus, and they all come to him immediately. Why? Well, he didn't know what his name was. But they knew about him because they could see him everywhere, and they were worshiping him. And usually when you finally get into it, why did they finally get a missionary? Well, they were praying to actually know who it was that they were seeing all around them. And so God sends them somebody to tell them. It's evident to them, it says here in Romans. For since the creation of the world, his invisible attributes, his eternal power and divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood through what has been made, so that they're without excuse. For even though they knew God, they did not honor him as God or give thanks, but they became futile in their speculations, and their foolish heart was darkened. Professing to be wise, they became fools, and exchanged the glory of the incorruptible God for an image in the form of corruptible man and of birds and four-footed animals and crawling creatures. And you immediately start thinking about all these different nations that worship bugs, Egypt, or worship animals, or worship these things that are half man, half animal, like they did in Rome. And you start going, yep, I can see that. I can exactly see that. So it says, God gave them over in the lust of their hearts to impurity, so that their bodies would be dishonored among them. For they exchanged the truth of God for a lie, and worshipped and served the creature rather than the Creator, who is blessed forever. Amen. So at a point in time, if the people continue down a path of sin, God says, I'm done with you. And he does that. He did that in Genesis chapter 11 with the nations at Babel. He has done that over and over and over again. And I'm just hopeful that he hasn't done that with the United States. But sometimes you wonder. You've actually seen in the history of the world where that's happened, where all of a sudden it's just like God's hand's been removed from a nation. And they start going downhill. For this reason, God gave them over to degrading passions. This is the characteristics of a nation that God's removed his hand from. Their women exchanged the natural function for that which is unnatural. And in the same way, also the men abandoned the natural function of the woman and burned in their desire toward one another. Men with men committing indecent acts and receiving in their own persons the due penalty of the error. This is Paul, and this is God's word. I'm not making this up here. And just as they did not see fit to acknowledge God any longer, God gave them over to a depraved mind to do those things which are not proper, being filled with all unrighteousness, wickedness, greed, evil, full of envy, murder, strife, deceit, malice. And some of us feel good because that doesn't sound like us. Then he starts going down a list that sounds like me. They're gossips, slanderers, haters of God, insolent, arrogant, boastful, inventors of evil, disobedient to parents, without understanding, untrustworthy, unloving, unmerciful. And although they know the ordinance of God, that those who practice such things are worthy of death, they not only do the same, but give hearty approval to those who practice them. Welcome to Babel in Genesis chapter 11. That's what was going on there. God separated out of the people. Some of them continued to follow him. There is historical evidence that the Chinese worshipped one God for an extended period of time, and then all of a sudden stopped. But they left, and they were still worshipers of the Lord. Paul further identifies in Ephesians 6 that there are powers behind the throne. He identifies these members of the council that we talked about that existed back in Genesis chapter 11. Ephesians 6:12. Our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against who? The rulers, the powers, the world forces of this darkness, against the spiritual forces of wickedness in the heavenly places. That's who our battle's with. We're fighting against those guys. And they sometimes will rule over a nation, send a nation an interesting direction. Sometimes they have a guy who's the leader of that nation who's 3 sheets short of a full deck, like the ruler of North Korea, and it becomes very easy. But for others, they have to use deception. But that's what they're doing. Daniel chapter 10, Daniel gives us a view into this world, that Paul alludes to and that is alluded to in Genesis chapter 11. In Daniel 10, verse 18, Daniel has been praying for a word from God. He's been looking to the Lord for some direction, some guidance. He needs to know something. And for 21 days, he's been fasting and praying. And then all of a sudden, somebody shows up. So we pick it up in verse 18. Then this one with human appearance touched me again and strengthened me. He said, O man of high esteem, do not be afraid. Peace be with you. Take courage and be courageous. Now, as soon as he spoke to me, I received strength and said, my Lord, speak, for you have strengthened me. And he said, do you understand why I came to you? But I shall now return to fight against the prince of Persia. He's talking to Gabriel, is who he's talking to. I will now return to fight against the prince of Persia. Huh? He's not, what do you mean the prince of Persia? Who's the prince of Persia? Satan, or the fallen angel who's overruling Persia. So I'm going forth, and behold, the prince of Greece is about to come. What? He's talking to Daniel in Babylon about Persia, and Greece isn't even a world power, but he's saying, I'm going to have to fight him too. So Gabriel's saying, look, I was in a battle with the prince of Persia. I'm going to have to go back and fight this guy who's the prince of Greece. But I'll tell you what's inscribed in the writing of truth, yet there is no one who stands firmly with me against these forces except Michael, your prince. So we have identified for us one of the members of that council. His name is Michael. He is an angel. He is the one who's overseeing Israel. That's his job. We see him show up a couple of times in the scriptures, and Gabriel shows up a couple of times too. That's Michael's job. That's what he does. And Gabriel could not hold off that prince, and Michael had to come and help him. But we pick up in these scriptures that some of these leaders of the nations no longer rule as God wanted them to. They're rebelling. They're trying to stop God's purpose and principles from being established on planet Earth. They want something else to be established, and it has nothing to do with the Lord. They want their own plan to be established. Some, even in their rebellion, had substituted themselves for God in order to be worshipped. When we were talking about Ammon and Edom and Moab, and then talking about their gods, it was more like God was talking directly to a person, talking that you're going to go into captivity, talking to the God, and you're going like, well, it's just a statue. No, it's not. There's a power behind that. That's who he's talking to. Asaph, who was a worship leader during the rule of David, in one of his psalms gives us more insight, and it's Psalm 82. And he talks about this congregation, this ruling group. Psalm 82, God takes his stand in his own congregation. He's taking his stand in this group of people, that are these group of divine beings, angels, that he has as his counsel. In the midst of the rulers, how long will you judge unjustly and show partiality to the wicked? He's calling them out for what they're doing. Vindicate the weak and fatherless. Do justice to the afflicted and destitute. Rescue the weak and needy. Deliver them out of the hand of the wicked. They do not know, nor do they understand. They walk about in darkness. All the foundations of the earth are shaken. I said you are gods, and all of you are sons of the Most High. But God's going to judge them, because he tells them, nevertheless, you're all going to die like men and fall like any one of the princes. And then he says, arise, God, judge the earth, for it's you who possesses all the nations. That's pointing to the end of the age. He's all of a sudden talking about these angels who are fallen. We see in the book of Revelation they're going to be thrown to earth with Satan, and they have a short period of time, and so that's called the tribulation, the last part of it. And then what we have happening is God then comes and judges the earth in the person of Jesus Christ, and they're all booted out, and now you have to have a new group of people move in, and that's believers. And we see that in the book of Revelation, that believers are the ones who will be ruling and reigning with Jesus Christ at the end, after all this takes place. 1 Kings 22, 19 to 23, we see some more about this. Again, this group. We see it in the scriptures occasionally. It doesn't, and sometimes it passes right by you if you're reading. Micaiah, and he's a prophet, said, therefore, hear the word of the Lord. I saw the Lord sitting on his throne, and all the host of heaven standing by him on his right and on his left. So he sees God with this council. He sees him. And the Lord said to this council, who will entice Ahab to go up and fall at Ramoth Gilead? In other words, it's time that we get rid of Ahab. He's a bad king. Who wants to entice him and whack him? How are we going to do this? That's what he's asking. And one said this while another said that. Then a spirit came forward and stood before the Lord and said, I'll entice him. And the Lord said to him, how? And he said, I will go out and be a deceiving spirit in the mouth of his prophets. Then he said, you are to entice him and also prevail. Go and do so. Now therefore, behold, the Lord has put a deceiving spirit in the mouth of all these your prophets, and the Lord has proclaimed disaster against you. We had a picture drawn for us by the prophet just then of what was going on. We get another picture in the book of Job when Satan shows up and starts saying, have you seen Job? He's got everything great. Let me go do this. And God says, yeah, okay, but don't touch him. Don't hurt him. You can do this. And you notice that there are some very specific outlines that God gives them. He doesn't say you've got a free rein. He says you still have to work within my instructions. But I find it interesting that he's basically saying, well, I have no idea what these other guys said. One may have said, hey, I'll make him kill himself. Or I'm going to use, he basically says, let's have the prophets prove that they really are false. Well, that's God's purpose anyhow. They are false.
You've been listening to a message from Ezekiel on the Unsafe Bible. Pastor Ken has been diving deep into this major prophet to help us all understand how to apply these messages to our lives today. Have you ever found yourself falling into the trap of sin, suffering the consequences, and then, only after you realize it's too late, you offer up a prayer and ask God, why me? It's a classic case of you made your bed and now you have to sleep in it. But you still ask the question, as if to suggest you may not be guilty. Well, as we see here in Ezekiel, that has been one of man's greatest weaknesses throughout history. If you want to hear more, don't hesitate to contact us. You can get in touch with us by going to theunsafebible.com. Once there, use the Connect tab and click on Connect Card. Just fill out the form and we'll reach out to you. To listen to this message or any others from Pastor Ken, just look under the Media tab at theunsafebible.com. If you found this ministry to be a blessing to you as you've been listening, you can show us your support for the Unsafe Bible Ministry by checking out the Give tab. No gift is too big or too small, and will help us continue to reach the lost with God's Word. Any other questions? Feel free to explore theunsafebible.com for more information about when and where we meet. Directions can be found on the Contact tab. We're based out of Jupiter, Florida, and want to invite you to join us in person for our next service. Until then, we want to thank you for joining us right here on the Unsafe Bible.